Some rulers changed the world, only to be nearly erased from it. From a Babylonian burning king betrayed by his own son, to a sun-worshipping pharaoh who rewrote religion, to a Roman emperor so reviled they tried to wipe out every trace of him. These are some of history's most mysterious kings who they tried to erase from time. Sennacherib was king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire and is remembered mostly for his brutal military campaigns, including the destruction of Babylon, which he completely leveled in 689 BCE. He moved the empire's capital and then turned it into one of the most extravagant cities of its time, complete with gardens and palaces and aqueducts. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was an innovator who took infrastructure very seriously. But as impactful as he was also almost scrubbed from the historical record after his death. According to ancient records, Sennacherib was killed by one of his own sons in a temple, possibly as revenge for naming a younger sibling heir to the throne. This led to a civil war, and his successor, Akhenaten, one of his sons, worked hard to legitimize his own rule, and part of that involved erasing parts of his father, Sennacherib's legacy, especially his attack on Babylon, which many viewed as sacrilege. Temples he damaged were rebuilt, inscriptions were rewritten or ignored, and his reputation was buried under official records that made Akhenaten look like a restorer rather than the son of a destroyer. So for someone who left such a mark on history, Sennacherib was nearly forgotten for centuries, until archaeologists in the 19th century uncovered what the scribes tried to hide. Akhenaten ruled Egypt during the 18th dynasty and completely flipped the country's religion on its head. He abandoned the traditional group of gods and worshipped only one, Aten, the sun disk. He'd ushered in monotheism, and that might not sound wild by today's standard, but in ancient Egypt it was a radical shift. He even moved the capital to a brand new city he built called Akhenaten, now known as Amarna. Akhenaten saw himself as a sort of high priest and messenger of Aten, and his art and monuments portrayed him in bizarre, almost alien-looking ways, elongated heads, wide hips, big eyes, all of which were very different from the rigid Egyptian style people were used to. After Akhenaten died, though, the old ways came back. His successors, including the famous King Tut, restored the traditional gods and abandoned Amarna. What followed was one of the most aggressive erasure campaigns in history. His name was chiseled off of monuments, his statues were smashed, and official king lists skipped him over entirely. For a long time, no one knew he even existed. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries, when archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Amarna and pieced together inscriptions, that Akhenaten's reign was truly recognized. For a man who tried and got very close to reshaping an entire civilization, he also came very close to being forgotten forever. Nero wasn't technically a king, he was the Roman emperor, but his story fits perfectly here. He came to power as a teenager and started off promising, but it didn't take long for things to spiral. He killed his own mother and his wife. He's also remembered for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, which many people believed he either caused or failed to stop because he was too busy performing music. After the fire, Nero found a convenient scapegoat in the Christians and launched a horrific persecution against them. His public image tanked though, and eventually the Senate declared him an enemy of the state. He fled and took his own life before he could be captured. After his death, Rome launched what was called a damnatio memoriae against him, a formal condemnation of memory. His statues were torn down, his name was removed from public inscriptions, and later Roman historians absolutely dragged him. Despite all that though, lower-class Romans weirdly liked him, and there were even rumors of imposters claiming to be Nero years after his death. Still, the official record tried hard to erase him, and for a long time, history treated him more like a myth than a real ruler. Richard II became King of England as a very young man, and spent most of his early reign dealing with advisors who ran the country for him. As he grew older, he tried to assert his authority, but it didn't go very well. He was seen as extravagant, obsessed with court life, and just out of touch with of the people. His harsh treatment of rivals and his reliance on a small circle of favorites didn't help matters much. Eventually, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke led a successful rebellion and overthrew Richard and became King Henry IV. After being captured, Richard was imprisoned and later died in mysterious circumstances, most likely killed, though officially it was hunger or illness. Henry IV didn't just take the throne, he also went to work erasing Richard's legacy. Portraits and coins of Richard were replaced and official records were edited to present him as a tyrant who had to be removed for the good of the kingdom. His reign was painted as unstable and dangerous. It wasn't until much later, especially during the Tudor period and again in the 20th century, that historians began re-examining his rule with a more balanced view. But for centuries, Richard was the king nobody really wanted to talk about. Hygelac is one of the more obscure rulers on this list, and most people today only know his name because he shows up in the epic poem Beowulf as Beowulf's uncle and king. But Hygelac was a real historical figure. He was the king of the Geats, a North Germanic tribe, and he died in a raid somewhere near modern-day France. The historian Gregory of Tours briefly mentions him in his 6th century writings, calling him a giant of a man who led a disastrous raid against the Franks and was killed in battle. After his death, there's almost nothing about him in historical records. It's like he just vanished, and most of what we think we know about him is pieced together from legend, especially from Beowulf, where he's portrayed as a noble, generous king. But in terms of actual history, there's barely a trace. His kingdom, the Geats, eventually faded into the Swedes, and his memory was buried along with them. If it weren't for a few lines in an old poem and a single mention by a Frankish historian, Hygelac would be completely forgotten. Next is King Phocas, who came to power in the Byzantine Empire the old-fashioned way by leading a military coup. He overthrew Emperor Maurice, who had been unpopular but was still the legitimate ruler. Phocas wasn't exactly welcomed as a hero either. His reign is considered one of the most brutal and incompetent in Byzantine history. He launched purges against anyone he saw as a threat, and his paranoia led to this reign of terror within the palace walls. On top of that, the empire was falling apart. The Sasanian Empire invaded, and the Eastern Front collapsed under his rule. Eventually, a general named Heraclius rose up against him, captured Constantinople, and executed Phocas in a very public and humiliating way. Heraclius then began scrubbing Phocas from history. His images were removed, inscriptions were defaced, and official records downplayed or just outright ignored his reign. He was even left off some lists of emperors. For a while, it was like he never had ruled at all. It wasn't until much later that historians started to piece together his story, and even then, most of what we know comes from biased sources who hated him. Charles II of Navarre, often called Charles the Bad, earned that nickname honestly. He was one of the most conniving and manipulative rulers of 14th century Europe. He constantly switched sides during the 100 Years' War, aligning with England or France depending on what suited him at the moment. He was deeply involved in plots and betrayals. Even his death was bizarre. According to legend, he was wrapped in brandy-soaked cloth as a medical treatment, and then a servant accidentally set him on fire with a candle. Whether or not that's true, it's a fittingly grim end for a king with such a dark reputation. After he died, the French crown wanted nothing to do with this guy. His reputation was so toxic that his legacy was quietly pushed aside, especially in France, where he had once tried to claim the throne. He was excluded from most honorable mentions, and his name rarely shows up in positive historical records. Yes, Bluetooth was a real historical figure, not just a tech company name. Harald the Bluetooth was king of Denmark and parts of Norway, and he was known for uniting various Danish tribes and converting the region to Christianity. He left behind massive runestones that still stand today, which praise his accomplishments. He was also a skilled builder, overseeing construction of bridges, roads, and forts, but Harald eventually fell out of favor, especially with his own son, Svein Forkbeard, who led a rebellion against him. Harald was wounded in battle and died not long after, probably in exile. Svein became king and immediately started redefining the narrative. He focused on his own power and expansion, especially his future conquest of England, while Harold's legacy faded. Even though Harald literally helped shape Denmark, his memory was overshadowed. His name was mostly lost to the general public until modern tech revived it in the 90s, with engineers naming the Bluetooth wireless technology after him, symbolizing that unification of devices, a nod to how Harald united the Danes. Louis XVI came into power at a terrible time. France was broke, the population was restless. A lot of new ideas were also starting to spread in Europe about how governments should work. Louis tried to implement reforms, but he was indecisive and slow, constantly bouncing between advisors, never fully committing to a plan. When the French Revolution broke out, he was seen as a symbol of everything wrong with the old regime. He was arrested, tried for treason, and publicly executed by guillotine in 1793. After his death, the revolutionaries erased symbols of the monarchy across France. His name was removed from public monuments and royal tombs were desecrated. While later monarchs tried to rehabilitate his image, his reputation never fully recovered. His reign is still mostly remembered as the final failure of France's monarchy, and it kinda was. He wasn't the worst ruler France ever had though, just the one who happened to be in charge when everything fell apart. Emperor Valens ruled the Eastern Roman Empire during a time of increasing pressure from outside forces, especially the Gothic tribes. He made a series of questionable decisions that led to one of Rome's most devastating defeats, the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE. Valens underestimated the Gothic threat, didn't wait for reinforcements, and just marched his army into a trap. The Roman forces were annihilated, and Valens himself died in battle, possibly even burnt alive in a farmhouse trying to hide. This battle marked a turning point that exposed serious weaknesses in the Roman military and opened the door for more barbarian invasions in the years to come. After his death, Valens was harshly criticized, of course, especially by Roman historians. He was blamed for one of the worst military disasters in their history, and his name became synonymous with failure and embarrassment. Later emperors and writers had no reason to celebrate him, as he gradually disappeared from the public record. With all that said, I've been your host James, and I'll catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.